In Peter Leeson's Anarchy Unbound, Leeson discusses how self-governance can work sometimes more efficiently than what most imagine. Kevin Ambrose and Nick Taylor will detail Leeson's writings.
In one of Leeson's first points, he talks about the idea of self-enforcing exchange. The fact that societies can go through and establish mutually beneficial trade relationships and have these great exchanges going through without a government. One of the key ideas that Leeson talks about is the idea of trust in these exchanges. People interacting need to be able to trust that they will be able to receive payment, that they can trust the person that they're going through this exchange process with. And it can work really well, especially in a small group of people that, for instance, a village in a certain area, that they can go through and know each other really, really well. A next area that Peter Leeson goes through and talks about are some of the institutions that can develop within an anarchical state. The fact that there can be laws in this lawlessness. He cites some brutal areas of conflict that have happened throughout world history that really document these types of institutions and orders that can be brought about. For instance, during the 1600s, there was a brutal border war between England and Scotland. Yet, within this area of lawlessness, people were able to come together and create these institutions and these customs and certain limitations on what could be allowed during these border conflicts and border raids. Another great example of this is looking at the both sides in World War I, where they would, for instance, stop fighting on Christmas Eve in order to celebrate Christmas together, something that isn't sanctioned by either government, and within those war zones, it's basically an anarchical state, yet they were able to come through and design these institutions to benefit from. A next area that Leeson talks about is how exactly can you go about trading with bandits? This is really interesting because Leeson takes an in-depth look at sub-Saharan Africa in the 1800s. He argues that some of the traders were at first taking advantage of local producers that were trying to trade and get better relationships with the outside world. Due to the fact that the bandits, or the traders in this case, were ransacking villages in order to sack them for profits, the producers were able to introduce credit systems where they'd get paid ahead of time, and secondly, that any traders would have to pay a tribute as a form of a risk premium in order to facilitate these exchanges. This worked remarkably well and helped to stop some of the issues that they were seeing earlier on, showing that even in a lawless state, we can have some good trade. A next area that Leeson talks in depth about is, well, what happens is if there is plundering going on? What happens if people are going through and stealing things? This is really bad overall for society for a couple of reasons. The first being that you have to spend money to steal these things. The original producers have to spend resources to defend it, and there's just deadweight loss involved, which is overall bad. However, even within this, there were contracts established that forfeited, say, some cargo on the high seas to a pirate in order to save lives and to save some of the property overall. And this could even occur when the government sanctioned these activities, but often it occurred privately. A final area that Leeson talks about is our pirates' private order. And what this is talking about is that within society, sometimes you have groups that are just made up of bad people. People that are, for instance, pirates. However, within these types of societies, and even the most horrible groups of people, they can still come up with democratic constitutions and internal functions without a government in order to keep order and peace. This could often be very democratic and have very, very high satisfaction, even higher than what most governments can get.
Leeson's next area is titled Criminal Constitutions, where he discusses criminal gangs and how they have constitutions that work similarly to societal constitutions. Criminal constitutions and organizations work exactly the same as our organizations within our government, where they come together for a common purpose and must create a social order in order to maximize their profit. Unlike Hewlett-Packard, they don't rely on our government to prohibit illegal activities. Leeson cites the example of La Nuestra Familia, a self-governing prison gang in California. Their constitution is like a contract, which they come together to form a constitution to create a common consensus with first with common knowledge of organizational rules, second to regulate individual behavior, and third to share information about misconduct, penalties, and enforcement. The more homogeneous the group, the less likely it is to create a working constitution. Leeson's next area of the book is titled An Easier Path, where he discusses applying principles of self-government to make the world a better place. First, Leeson talks about efficient anarchy. Anarchy can be more beneficial to society than the alternative government. He poses the question why, even with ideal governments, would some choose self-governance? Leeson discusses that there are two types of government. The first is efficient, where government is less costly than the benefits of trade within the government. The second is an inefficient government, where government is more costly than the benefit that they gain from trade. Governments are going to come with a cost, and it's all about whether or not benefits outweigh the cost. The benefits of government, Leeson discusses anarchy's efficiency depending on government's cost related to government's benefit by moving society to the higher trade equilibrium. Leeson's next essay is titled Better Off Stateless, where Leeson discusses well-functioning governments and not well-functioning governments. More than half of the world has either critically or dangerously dysfunctional governments, which are usually poor. He poses the next question, does any government mean it is better than no government? Leeson's example of Somalia discusses how post-World War II they instituted a socialist centrally planned government, and in 1991 a coup was staged and no government could grasp power. 2007 was the end of anarchy, where the transitional federal government was instituted, and Leeson looks at the time where anarchy reigned versus when the time the transitional federal government was instituted. 14 out of 18 factors said that anarchy increased societal well-being with unambiguous growth. We must look at the alternative to anarchy for what type of government would be instituted. Leeson's next issue is an argument for anarchy in least developed countries. Governments in anarchy come in ranges. High, which are ideal or close to ideal, or low, which are dysfunctional. Most see replacing chaos with government closer to a Western style, which is closer to ideal, but it usually ends up being like Somalia. This mindset only works when you equate chaos with anarchy. For Somalia, an American style of government is just not in the cards. We must take into effect a country's history and the time that it must take after its history to get to a closer type of government. Sometimes anarchy is going to be better. Leeson's last issue is looking at a future for thinking about self-governance, where he discusses individuals are unable to rely on government to give social cooperation to find their own way, which is sometimes surprising. He also discusses sometimes these mechanisms are better off at producing more social cooperation than the realistic government alternative. Self-government is rooted in superstition, which Leeson gives as an example, which even in these superstitious governances, they still create a social order. He cites the example of West Francia monks using curses to protect private property.
So, in conclusion, Leeson gives a really strong argument that we can have a society that governs itself, and that, to an extent, it's going to be very hard to actually go through and fix the government. His famous pirate example can answer a lot of questions. It can give a lot of good proof as to how we can fix society and how we can live together at lower cost in a highly mutually beneficial relationship. However, there's just one question that Leeson is not able to answer in the problems of pirates and anarchy.